In 2003, a hunting party had an encounter that four men would later describe in consistent detail to separate investigators. Daniel Ortega, James Ruiz, Paul Martinez, and Victor Salazar had known each other since childhood. All grew up in Henderson, a suburb of Las Vegas. They made an annual tradition of hunting mule deer in the high desert country of Lincoln County, an area they'd been visiting together for more than a decade. They knew the terrain, knew the roads, and knew how to stay safe. That November, they set up camp in their usual spot, a flat area near a seasonal creek bed, about 10 miles from the nearest maintained road. Number: Shapeshifters, witnessed in the Nevada desert. The footage is grainy, shot through a windshield somewhere along Highway 375. A figure stands motionless beside the road. At first glance, it appears human. Tall, maybe 6 feet, wearing what looks like dark clothing. The driver slows down, perhaps thinking someone needs help. Then the figure moves. Not with the fluid motion of a person walking, but with a stutter, like frames skipping in old film. One moment upright, the next hunched over, limbs bending at angles that shouldn't be possible. The video cuts off. The driver never posted it online, never spoke about it publicly, but the clip made its way through private forums, passed between researchers who track phenomena in the American Southwest. Just another unexplained encounter in a region that seems to specialize in them. Nevada's desert has always been a place where reality feels negotiable, where the line between what we know and what we fear grows dangerously thin. The highway itself carries a nickname. Locals call it the Extraterrestrial Highway, a designation made official by the state in 1996. Tourists drive it looking for UFO sightings or hoping to catch a glimpse of classified aircraft from nearby military installations. But those who live along its 98-mile stretch know that the strangeness extends beyond lights in the sky. The desert on either side of the road holds older mysteries, things that predate Cold War secrets and government projects, things that have walked this landscape since before anyone thought to name it. The state of Nevada contains roughly 11,000 square miles of territory. More than 80% of that land is owned by the federal government. Vast stretches remain unmapped in any meaningful detail. No roads, no settlements, just endless expanses of sage and sand under a sky that seems too big for the horizon. The Mojave Desert dominates the southern regions. The Great Basin sprawls across the north. Between them lies terrain that has remained largely unchanged for thousands of years. Indigenous peoples inhabited these lands long before European contact. The western Shoshone, southern Paiute and Washoe tribes all maintained presence here, their oral traditions filled with warnings about creatures that walked on 2 legs but were not human. The Spanish explorers who first traversed this region in the 1772 noted in their journals that their native guides refused to travel through certain areas after dark. They spoke of beings that could take the shape of animals or men, entities that hunted at the boundaries between day and night. The journals describe these warnings but dismiss them as superstition. By the mid-1800s, American settlers pushing westward encountered similar stories. Trappers and miners reported strange sightings in isolated canyons, figures that seemed human from a distance but wrong somehow, too tall or moving with an unnatural gait. Ranch hands swore they saw coyotes that stood upright for just a moment before dropping to all fours and vanishing into the brush. One particularly detailed account comes from 1889, found in the diary of a prospector named William Hastings. He was working a claim in the Monitor Range, a remote series of peaks in central Nevada. Hastings wrote about finding tracks near his camp that appeared human but were pressed far too deep into the earth for a person of normal weight. The stride length suggested someone over 7 feet tall. He followed the tracks for nearly a mile before they simply ended in the middle of a rocky clearing. No rocks had been disturbed to suggest climbing. The tracks just stopped. 3 days later, Hastings abandoned his claim and left the area. His final entry stated simply that he would not remain where something could watch him without being seen. The term skinwalker comes from Navajo tradition, though the concept exists in various forms across many indigenous cultures. In Navajo belief, a skinwalker is a type of harmful witch who has gained the ability to transform into animals. The practice requires the violation of sacred taboos, acts so heinous that those who commit them forfeit their humanity. Stories describe skinwalkers wearing the pelts of animals to facilitate transformation, using forbidden knowledge to blur the boundary between human and beast. The Navajo reservation sits primarily in Arizona and New Mexico, far from Nevada's northern deserts. Yet similar entities appear in the mythology of tribes throughout the Southwest. The Ute people spoke of beings they called skinwalkers that could shift form and brought misfortune to those who encountered them. Nevada itself became a focal point for the strange and unexplained during the Cold War. The Nevada test site, established in 1951, became the primary location for nuclear weapons testing. Over the following decades, more than 900 nuclear detonations occurred there, most underground, but many in the open atmosphere. The tests drew attention to Nevada's remote spaces. Military installations proliferated. Restricted zones expanded, and with them came reports of unusual activity that had nothing to do with atomic research. Workers at the test site reported seeing things in the desert that defied explanation. Strange lights, certainly, but also figures that appeared and vanished, shadows that moved independently of any light source. Security personnel at the perimeter experienced incidents that rarely made official reports. One guard, whose name was withheld but whose account was verified by 3 colleagues, described watching something cross between 2 sensor posts in 1978. The motion detectors registered movement. The infrared cameras captured a heat signature, but when the footage was reviewed, it showed only a blur, a shape that seemed to shift between frames, sometimes appearing 4-legged, sometimes 2. The recording was classified and removed from the standard archive. The guards were told they had witnessed a desert fox and advised not to discuss it further. By the 1980s, Nevada had earned a reputation among UFO researchers and paranormal investigators. Area 51, located within the Nevada Test and Training Range, became synonymous with government secrets and alien technology. But beneath the flying saucer stories, another pattern emerged. People who ventured into the deep desert came back with accounts of encounters that felt older, more primal than crashed spacecraft. They described seeing animals that behaved impossibly, humanoid figures that shouldn't exist, experiences that left them questioning what they witnessed. In the summer of 1997, a geology student named Marcus Webb was conducting field research in the remote reaches of Nye County. He had permission to collect samples from public land near the Reveille Range, a series of low mountains roughly 100 miles northwest of Las Vegas. The area sees almost no traffic. No towns exist within 30 miles in any direction. Temperatures regularly exceed 110 degrees Fahrenheit during summer months. Most researchers avoid it, but Webb needed specific mineral samples for his thesis, and the Reveille Range contained exactly what he sought. He set out alone on a Thursday morning in late June, driving a university truck along dirt roads that barely qualified as paths. His plan was simple: drive to a marked waypoint, collect samples, and return before sunset. He brought water, basic supplies, and a satellite phone in case of emergency. The collection site sat in a shallow canyon, a dried riverbed that had carved through ancient rock formations. Webb reached it around noon. The heat was oppressive, the kind that makes the air shimmer and distances impossible to judge. He began his work, carefully extracting samples and logging their locations. The canyon walls rose about 40 feet on either side, not particularly high, but enough to create a sense of enclosure. Around 3 in the afternoon, Webb noticed movement along the canyon rim to his north. He looked up and saw what appeared to be a coyote. Not unusual. Coyotes are common throughout Nevada, opportunistic predators that adapt well to desert conditions. This one stood motionless, watching him. Webb went back to his work. When he glanced up again a few minutes later, the coyote was gone, but now there was a man standing in roughly the same spot, tall, wearing what looked like jeans and a dark shirt. Too far away to make out facial features clearly, but definitely human. Definitely out of place. Webb called out, asking if the person needed help. No response. The figure remained still. Unease crept into Webb's mind. There was no vehicle anywhere in sight, no explanation for how someone could be out here on foot. He called out again. The figure turned away and walked behind an outcropping of rock. Relieved but still confused, Webb decided to finish his work quickly and leave. He spent another 30 minutes collecting samples, glancing frequently toward the canyon rim. Nothing moved up there. The sun beat down. Heat waves distorted the landscape. When Webb finally packed his equipment and headed back to his truck, he felt watched. An irrational sensation perhaps, but persistent. The sensation grew stronger as he walked. The canyon walls seemed to close in. Every shadow looked like it might contain something waiting. Webb picked up his pace, equipment rattling in his pack. His truck sat where he'd left it, baking in the afternoon sun. He loaded his samples quickly, hands shaking slightly, though he told himself it was just the heat and exhaustion. The interior of the truck was like an oven. He started the engine and cranked the air conditioning, sitting for a moment to let the temperature drop. That's when he saw it in the side mirror. The figure from the canyon rim, standing about 50 yards behind the truck, watching. Webb twisted in his seat to look directly, but saw nothing. He checked the mirror again, still there. He looked back over his shoulder. Empty desert. The discrepancy made no sense. Mirrors reflect what's there. They don't create images, but every time he used the mirror, the figure appeared. Every time he looked directly, nothing. He drove about 2 miles back along the dirt track when he saw something in the middle of the road ahead. He slowed down. It was a coyote, not unusual, except this one wasn't moving out of the way. It sat on its haunches directly in the path, watching the approaching vehicle. Webb stopped about 50 feet away and honked the horn. The coyote didn't react. He honked again. Nothing. Then it stood up. But it didn't stand the way a coyote should. It rose up on its hind legs, front paws hanging down, and remained upright. For perhaps 5 seconds, it stood there like a person wearing a coyote costume. Then it dropped to all fours and bolted off the road into the sage. Webb sat frozen behind the wheel. His rational mind tried to explain what he'd seen. Perhaps the coyote had been stretching. Perhaps the heat and the angle had created an optical illusion. But he'd seen it clearly. The animal had stood upright with a posture no coyote could naturally maintain. And the way it looked at him before dropping down, that gaze held something that felt uncomfortably aware, intelligent. He drove on, faster than the rough road recommended, not stopping until he reached the paved highway. Later, when he tried to describe the experience to his colleagues, he found the words inadequate. They listened politely, but clearly thought the heat had gotten to him. Webb requested a different research site for the remainder of his fieldwork. His thesis advisor questioned the decision. The Reveille Range samples were important to his project. Changing locations would mean starting over with a new set of data, but Webb refused to return. He completed his degree using inferior samples from more accessible areas. Years later, when interviewed by a paranormal researcher, he admitted that the encounter had shaken something fundamental in his worldview. He had always been a scientist, a person who trusted observable, measurable phenomena. What he saw that day couldn't be measured or explained. It simply was. And knowing it existed somewhere out there, in those empty spaces between roads, made him reconsider what else might be real. 3 months later, and 150 miles to the north, a different encounter would prove harder to dismiss. Sarah and Tom Keller ran a small ranch outside Austin, Nevada. The town itself barely qualifies as one, population hovering around 200. The Kellers raised cattle on land that had been in Tom's family for 3 generations. They were practical people, accustomed to the realities of ranch life. Predators were a fact of existence: coyotes, mountain lions, the occasional bear. They took precautions, moved the herd when necessary, and accepted some losses as inevitable. But in October of 1997, something began killing their cattle in ways that defied any predator they knew. The first calf disappeared on a Tuesday night. They found it Wednesday morning, about a quarter-mile from the main pasture, partially eaten. The manner of death seemed wrong. Large sections of flesh had been removed, with what looked like precise cuts rather than the ragged tears a predator would leave. The heart and liver were missing entirely. No tracks led to or from the carcass, despite the soft ground that should have preserved clear prints. Tom examined the scene carefully. He'd dealt with predator kills before. This felt different. They reported it to the county sheriff, who took a report but offered little help. Budget cuts had reduced patrols in the rural areas. Unless they caught something in the act, there was little law enforcement could do. The temperature had dropped significantly by mid-October. Nevada's high desert climate swings dramatically between summer and fall. Days remained warm, but nights brought frost. The cold should have slowed predator activity. Most animals settled into their winter patterns, but the attacks continued. Tom started documenting each kill with photographs, noting the locations and the specific nature of the wounds. He sent copies to a veterinarian friend in Elko, hoping for some insight. The vet examined the photos and called him back within hours. He said the cuts looked surgical, clean edges, specific targeting of organs. Not the work of any natural predator he'd encountered in 30 years of practice. He suggested Tom contact wildlife officials. Maybe someone was conducting illegal activities on the property, poaching, or some kind of twisted research. Over the following 3 weeks, 4 more calves died. Each time, the pattern repeated. Bodies found away from the herd, surgical-like removal of specific organs, no tracks. The Kellers started keeping watch at night, taking shifts to patrol the property. They armed themselves with rifles and spotlights. The herd grew nervous, clustering together rather than spreading out to graze. On a Friday night in early November, Sarah was on watch duty. She sat in their truck overlooking the main pasture, a thermos of coffee beside her, a rifle across her lap. The moon was nearly full, providing enough light to see the dark shapes of cattle dotting the field. Around midnight, the herd began to move. Not stampeding, but flowing together like a school of fish reacting to a shark. Something was disturbing them. Sarah grabbed her spotlight and swept it across the pasture. The beam caught movement at the far edge, near the fence line. A person was walking along the perimeter. She could see the silhouette clearly, human proportions, moving on 2 legs. Her first thought was that someone was trespassing, maybe vandals or thieves. She started the truck and drove toward the figure, spotlight trained on it. As she got closer, details became clearer. The figure was tall, maybe 6.5 feet. It wore no clothing that she could see. And it moved strangely, with a loping gait that covered ground faster than a walking pace should allow. She was about 100 feet away when the figure stopped and turned toward her. The spotlight hit it full on. Sarah's mind struggled to process what she saw. The body was wrong. Proportions that seemed human from a distance revealed themselves as distorted up close, arms too long, legs jointed backward like a bird's. The head was the worst part, vaguely human in shape but flattened, with a wide mouth that split the face too far, and the eyes reflected the light back at her, glowing amber like an animal's. For a moment that felt frozen, they stared at each other. Then the thing dropped to all fours and ran, not like a person crawling, but fluid and fast, moving with the efficiency of a predator built for that posture. It cleared the fence in a single bound and vanished into the darkness beyond the reach of her light. Sarah drove back to the house at full speed and woke Tom. Her hands shook as she tried to explain what she'd seen. Tom grabbed his rifle and they both went back out, but found nothing. No tracks, no sign anything had been there. The cattle had calmed down. By morning, Sarah was questioning her own memory. Had the moonlight and shadows created something that wasn't there? Had exhaustion made her see things? But 2 days later, another calf was found dead. This time, Tom discovered something near the carcass. Prints in a patch of soft earth. They showed a 5-toed foot, almost human but elongated. The toes ended in what looked like claw marks. The prints indicated a bipedal stance. Whatever left them had been walking upright. Tom made plaster casts of the prints and brought them to a biologist friend who taught at a community college in Reno. The friend examined the casts carefully, compared them to known animal tracks, and finally admitted he couldn't identify them. The structure was wrong for a bear, which might rear up on hind legs but has a different foot shape. Wrong for a mountain lion. Wrong for any primate that should exist in Nevada. The friend suggested they might be fakes, though he couldn't imagine why someone would go to such elaborate lengths. The cattle killings stopped after that. No more calves died. The Kellers never saw the figure again. But they kept the plaster casts, physical evidence of something they couldn't explain. The incident left lasting effects on the ranch operations. The Kellers installed motion-activated cameras around the property perimeter. They recorded hundreds of hours of footage over the following months. Deer, coyotes, occasional cattle wandering near the fence line. Nothing unusual. Yet both Sarah and Tom reported feeling watched when they worked in the far pastures. Their dogs, normally confident animals, refused to go near certain areas of the property. One section of fence line, roughly 200 yards long, became a dead zone. No animal tracks appeared in the soft earth there. Birds didn't perch on the posts. Even insects seemed scarce. Tom tried to rationalize it. Maybe the soil composition was different. Maybe some mineral leaching from underground created an environment animals instinctively avoided, but he knew those explanations felt hollow. A neighboring rancher, Ed Morrison, mentioned his own troubles when Tom finally worked up the courage to discuss the experience. Morrison ran cattle about 15 miles to the east. He'd been losing livestock too, finding them dead with the same precise wounds, the same missing organs. Morrison had served in Vietnam. He was not a man easily spooked, but he told Tom that twice he'd seen something crossing his property at dawn, a figure that moved wrong, once on 2 legs, once on 4, both times at a distance that made clear identification impossible. Morrison had stopped talking about it because people looked at him like he'd lost his mind, but he believed something was out there, something that knew how to avoid being caught. Stories like these rarely make mainstream news. Local papers might run a brief piece about unexplained livestock deaths, but the stranger details get filtered out. The accounts that mention humanoid figures or impossible movements get dismissed as rural legends, the product of isolation and imagination. Yet they persist, spreading through informal networks. Ranch families talk to each other. Workers at remote facilities share experiences during downtime. A pattern emerges when you collect enough accounts. The sightings cluster in specific regions, areas with low population density, limited access, and terrain that offers concealment. The creatures, whatever they are, avoid contact. They appear at boundaries, dawn and dusk, moonlit nights. They seem curious about humans but wary, and when confronted directly, they flee. Researchers who have spent years investigating these phenomena note that Nevada's reports share characteristics with encounters from other parts of the Southwest. The Uinta Basin in Utah, parts of Arizona, near the Navajo Reservation, to remote areas of New Mexico, all have concentrations of similar sightings. Humanoid figures that shift between 2-legged and 4-legged movement. Entities that seem to blur the line between animal and human. Some investigators believe these might all be related, evidence of a single phenomenon that spans the region. Others think each area has its own unique population or manifestation. The lack of physical evidence makes definitive conclusions impossible. The Mutual UFO Network, or MUFON, maintains a database of unusual sightings. While primarily focused on aerial phenomena, they also collect reports of cryptid encounters. Nevada accounts in their system number in the hundreds. Most describe lights or craft, but a significant subset, roughly 15%, involve ground-based entities, figures that appear humanoid but aren't quite human, beings that move in impossible ways or seem to shift form. MUFON investigators have interviewed dozens of witnesses. The consistency of descriptions across unrelated reports suggests something more than mass delusion or copycat stories. People who have never heard of skinwalkers or shapeshifters describe seeing exactly what those legends describe. In 2003, a hunting party had an encounter that four men would later describe in consistent detail to separate investigators. Daniel Ortega, James Ruiz, Paul Williams, and Victor Salazar had known each other since childhood. All grew up in Henderson, a suburb of Las Vegas. They made an annual tradition of hunting mule deer in the high desert country of Lincoln County, an area they'd been visiting together for more than a decade. They knew the terrain, knew the roads, and knew how to stay safe. That November, they set up camp in their usual spot, a flat area near a seasonal creek bed about 10 miles from the nearest maintained road. The first 2 days of their trip were uneventful. They saw deer, though none close enough for a clean shot. They sat around the fire at night, drank beer, told the same old stories. On the third night, Paul woke around midnight needing to relieve himself. Their tents were set up in a loose circle around the fire pit, which had burned down to embers. Paul grabbed his flashlight and walked about 30 yards away to a cluster of juniper trees. As he finished and turned to head back, his light swept across something that froze him in place. A figure crouched near one of the tents, man-shaped but wrong, too thin, with limbs that bent at odd angles. It was doing something to the tent fabric, pulling at it with long fingers. Paul's shout woke the others. Daniel emerged from his tent first, fumbling with his own flashlight. The figure jerked upright and spun toward them. In the beam of 2 lights they saw it clearly. Grey-brown skin, hairless. A face that had eyes and a mouth but seemed incomplete somehow, like a sculpture that hadn't been finished. It made a sound, something between a hiss and a clicking, then bounded away on all fours. The movement was fast, unnaturally so. Within seconds it had covered 50 yards and disappeared into the darkness. Victor, who had grabbed a rifle, fired a shot into the air, not aiming at anything, just making noise. The report echoed across the desert. They waited, listening. Nothing moved. No sound returned. James suggested they might have scared off more than one. If that thing had companions, the gunshot should keep them away. They pulled all 4 tents closer together, creating a tight cluster, built the fire back up until flames leaped 6 feet high, took turns on watch through the rest of the night, but nothing else approached. When dawn finally came, they were exhausted, running on adrenaline and fear. The tent Paul had seen the creature touching was shredded along one side, not torn randomly, but with deliberate vertical cuts, like something had been trying to open it carefully, testing to see if it could get inside without alerting the occupant. The men spent the rest of the night armed and awake, the fire built back up to a blaze. When dawn came, they examined the tent the figure had been touching. Long scratches marked the fabric, as if something with claws had been testing its strength. They found prints nearby, the same elongated, human-like footprints the Kellers had cast years before. The hunting trip ended that morning. They packed up and left, none of them wanting to spend another night in that location. Later, when they discussed reporting it, they realized how absurd it would sound. 4 grown men claiming they'd been visited by some kind of humanoid creature? They'd be laughed out of the sheriff's office, so they kept it to themselves, though each man knew what he'd seen. The experience affected their friendship. For weeks afterward, they barely spoke to each other. When they finally met up at a bar in Henderson, the conversation was awkward. Each man had been processing the encounter in his own way. Daniel had convinced himself they'd seen a person, some disturbed individual living rough in the desert, perhaps suffering from a condition that affected their appearance and behavior. James thought it might have been a trained animal, maybe something that had escaped from a private collection. Paul couldn't settle on any explanation. He just knew that what he'd seen shouldn't exist. Victor, the quietest of the group, finally said what they'd all been thinking. Whatever that thing was, it had been curious about them. Not aggressive. It could have attacked while they slept. Instead, it had investigated their camp, touching their tent with what seemed like cautious interest. That somehow made it worse. The idea that something intelligent and unknown was out there, studying human beings the way researchers might study animals. None of them returned to that area. Their annual hunting trips continued, but they chose locations closer to civilization. In 2008, 5 years after the incident, Paul received a call from a researcher who specialized in cryptid sightings. Someone had leaked their story to an online forum. Paul agreed to an interview as long as his last name wasn't used. During that conversation, the researcher mentioned that Lincoln County had a concentration of similar reports. Something about that specific region seemed to attract encounters. The researcher had collected over 30 accounts from the past 2 decades, different witnesses, different times, but consistent descriptions. Thin, humanoid figures, gray or brown skin, movement that shifted between 2-legged and 4-legged, behavior that suggested intelligence and curiosity rather than animal instinct. The question of what these entities are remains unanswered. Theories range from the scientific to the supernatural. Some researchers suggest misidentified known animals. Bears with mange can look disturbingly humanoid when their fur falls out. They can stand on hind legs and from a distance might seem like something else. Coyotes with certain diseases might behave abnormally, appearing to walk upright or move in strange patterns. Heat distortion and poor lighting can transform ordinary animals into nightmare shapes. These explanations account for some sightings, certainly, but they struggle with cases where multiple witnesses provide consistent descriptions, where physical evidence like unusual tracks exists, where the behavior described goes beyond what known animals can do. Cryptozoologists propose undiscovered species, perhaps a surviving population of prehistoric hominids, something related to humans, but following a different evolutionary path. The American Southwest contains caves and canyons that have never been thoroughly explored. Could something survive there, avoiding detection by staying nocturnal and avoiding people? The biological requirements for such a species present problems. A breeding population would need minimum numbers to remain viable. They would leave more evidence, more traces. And yet, we continue to discover new species, even in well-studied regions. The possibility, however remote, exists. The fossil record offers some intriguing hints. Gigantopithecus, a massive ape that stood nearly 10 feet tall, survived in Asia until roughly 1,000,000 years ago. Much more recently, Homo floresiensis, the so-called hobbit species, lived on an Indonesian island until about 5,000 years ago. Both discoveries shocked the scientific community. Species we didn't know existed, surviving far longer than previously thought possible. Could something similar have happened in North America? The continent has undergone dramatic climate changes over the past 1,000 years. Species have gone extinct. Others have adapted and survived in isolated pockets. The vast, empty spaces of Nevada could theoretically hide a population of something unknown, but the complete absence of bones, of remains, of any physical specimen, makes this theory difficult to support. Paranormal researchers lean towards supernatural explanations. They point to the consistency with indigenous legends about shapeshifters and skinwalkers. Perhaps these entities exist outside normal biology, creatures of spirit or energy that can manipulate physical form. The sudden appearances and disappearances, the lack of tracks, the way they seem to fade or shift, all suggest something beyond flesh and blood. This interpretation resonates with those who've had encounters. Many describe a feeling of wrongness, a sense that they were seeing something that shouldn't exist, that violated natural law simply by being. The psychological explanation suggests these experiences stem from the human mind's tendency to pattern recognition and fear response. Alone in remote areas, under stress, our brains can create threats from ambiguous stimuli. Shadows become figures, animal sounds become sinister, ordinary movements seem menacing. The consistency of reports across different witnesses might simply reflect shared cultural narratives about monsters and shapeshifters, our minds filling in details based on stories we've heard rather than what we actually see. Sleep researchers note that isolation and sensory deprivation can trigger hallucinations. The desert environment, particularly at night, creates conditions that might induce altered states of consciousness. The vast silence, the darkness, the sense of exposure all put stress on the human nervous system. Under these conditions, the brain sometimes produces vivid experiences that feel completely real. This would explain why encounters so often happen at dawn or dusk, when light conditions make depth perception and shape recognition difficult. It would explain why people who are alone or with just one or two others tend to have experiences, while larger groups rarely report seeing anything unusual. Yet this explanation struggles with cases involving physical evidence. The tracks, the scratches on tent fabric, the consistent descriptions from multiple witnesses who had no prior contact with each other. Marcus Webb didn't know about the Kellers didn't know about the hunting party. Each witness experienced their encounter independently, yet described similar entities behaving in similar ways. The psychological explanation requires dismissing too much data, ignoring too many details that don't fit the pattern of hallucination or misperception. None of these explanations fully satisfies. Each accounts for some elements while leaving others unexplained. The footage continues to circulate. Plaster casts gather dust in garages and storage units. People who've had encounters know what they saw, even if they can't make others believe them. Nevada's desert keeps its secrets well. The empty spaces remain empty, the restricted zones stay restricted, and the things that move through the darkness between dunes and sage continue their existence, glimpsed but never caught, witnessed but never proven. What walks the Nevada desert? What changes shape between animal and human, watching travelers from canyon rims, testing tent fabric in the dead of night? Are they remnants of an older world, creatures that learned long ago to avoid the expanding reach of humanity? Are they visitors from somewhere else, studying us with intentions we can't fathom? Or are they simply what they've always been, the shapeshifters of indigenous warning, entities that exist at the boundary between this world and something older, something we've forgotten how to see? In 2019, a group of graduate students from the University of Nevada conducted a field study in the Pahranagat Valley. They were documenting wildlife patterns using motion-activated cameras. Over 3 months, they collected thousands of images: deer, coyotes, kit foxes, bobcats, all the expected species. But on one camera, positioned near a seasonal water source, they captured something else. The timestamp showed 3:17 inches the morning. The infrared image revealed a figure standing upright, roughly human in shape but wrong in proportion. The head seemed too large. The arms hung past where the knees should be. The image quality wasn't clear enough to make out fine details, just a shape caught in mid-step, moving through the frame. The next photo, taken 3 seconds later as programmed, showed nothing. The students debated what to do with the image: include it in their dataset and risk their credibility, exclude it and potentially ignore something significant. In the end, they kept it in their raw data files but didn't mention it in their published findings. One of the students, however, shared the image with a cryptozoology forum. It remains there, analyzed and debated, but never explained. Highway maintenance workers report their own experiences, though rarely officially. The crews that service the remote roads see things that don't make it into incident reports. One worker, employed by the Nevada Department of Transportation for over 20 years, described an encounter in 2015. He was part of a two-person crew repairing guardrails along Highway 375. They'd started work just after dawn. His partner was working the equipment while he prepared materials. Movement caught his attention. A figure was walking along the desert floor parallel to the road, about 200 yards out, human-shaped but moving with a stride that covered too much ground. The worker watched it for perhaps 30 seconds. Then his partner shouted for assistance and he turned away. When he looked back, the figure was gone. No place to hide existed in that stretch of flat desert. Nowhere it could have gone so quickly. He never mentioned it in any official capacity, but when interviewed years later, he remained certain of what he saw. Something walking where nothing should be. The desert doesn't answer. It simply remains, vast and indifferent, holding whatever truths it contains beneath its empty sky. Those who venture into its depths return changed or not at all. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the moon is full and the air is still, they see something watching from the darkness. Something that might be animal or might be human or might be neither. Something that reminds them how little we truly know about the world we think we've mapped and measured. The shapeshifters of Nevada, if that's what they are, continue their existence in the spaces we don't control, and perhaps that's exactly where they belong. If you've had an experience in Nevada's remote areas, if you've seen something that doesn't fit into comfortable categories, we'd like to hear about it. Share your story in the comments. And if you want more investigations into the unexplained, subscribe to the channel. The desert keeps many secrets. Some of them are still waiting to be told.